John Wetherell of Kayenta and his quest for the protection of the rugged Utah-Arizona borderland country, but it's really talk about the Rainbow Bridge Monument Valley expedition, as well as introducing my ancestors. One of the questions I think is important for this project is why? Why was there an expedition? And I want to explain that based on what I've been able to find. The country that we're talking about is kind of centered on Kayenta, Arizona. So you can see Monument Valley over here. Rainbow Bridge is way up in the corner there. And that whole region. You also see Old Jato up there. I'll talk a little bit about that. My great-grandparents lived in Old Jato, and then they moved to Kayenta and pretty much founded that town. So that's just a little orientation. To understand why there was a Rainbow Bridge Monument Valley expedition, the best source of that is this magazine article called Wanted 10 Explorers. This is something that Ansel Hall wrote before the first expedition. And I just wanted to quote a few things. One cannot be long in the Southwest without crossing the trail of John Wetherell. For years I have wanted to know him. Last autumn I drove out to Wetherell's trading post called Kayenta in the picturesque and and colorful Mesa country. So John Wetherell had this discussion with Ansel Hall. Why go into foreign countries? There's plenty of exploring to be done right here in this country. And as for scientific work, well, it's hardly been touched. There's an area of some 600 or 700 square miles lying between here and the San Juan and the Colorado that certainly needs looking into. So Ansel Hall was a visitor at the Wetherell's trading post and home, and John Wetherell had this conversation with him. That country, said Wetherell, should be a national park. Mr. Albright, the director of the National Park Service, was here last summer for a few days and seemed to be interested in the possibility. And the problem was the people back in Washington didn't think there was anything worthy of park status in that country. Wetherell squared around and suddenly, say, Mr. Hall, why don't you organize an expedition like you've been sending out the past 5 years for scientific exploration? Send a group of scientists into this country and turn out a report that will tell the National Park Service and the world about what's up there in that maze of canyons. That's why there was a Rainbow Bridge Monument Valley expedition.
What year was that?
That was 1933. But the actual proposal for a park goes back a little earlier. I'm going to talk about that now. First of all, I want to introduce John Wetherell and who he was and why he was even out in that country. Wetherell family in the early days lived in Mancos, Colorado. You see the parents, BK and Marion Wetherell. They had one daughter, Anna, and then 5 boys, and John was one of the boys. They had a ranch in Mancos, Colorado. This was starting in about 1881, and they owned it till about 1902. And in the background of that photo of the ranch is Mesa Verde. So in the process of looking after cattle up in the canyon Mesa country, Richard Wetherell and Charlie Mason ran across what's now known as Cliff Palace. And that was quite a earth-shattering event in the Wetherells' life, although they had been involved with Native Americans and archaeology before that. About the turn of the century, some of the boys started drifting away from Mancos. I guess it got to be too cosmopolitan for them. John and Louisa, his wife, and I'll introduce her later, moved to this Ojo Alamo, New Mexico in 1900. And then Richard in 1896 had moved to Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. That's Pueblo Bonito, Pueblo there. and Richard's ranch house right by the side of it. And John and Louisa ended up living there for a while also. But in 1906, my great-grandparents moved to Old Jato, Utah, west of Monument Valley. It was a very hard area to get into, and the Native Americans that lived there really didn't want outsiders, but they were able to persuade the people that it would be to everybody's benefit to have a trading post there, and that they were also very nice people. When they got there, they found none of the local residents could speak English. The Navajo Indians and Paiutes still lived in their traditional ways, but John and Louisa were very happy to be there, and they got along, I think, better with their Native American friends than they would have if they'd stayed in town. They had 2 children, a boy, Ben, and a girl, Georgia Ida, who all of her life went by the name of Sister. And Sister was my grandmother. Not long after they moved to the area, 1909, there was an interest in the cliff dwellings in that area, and the government decided to make a national monument to encompass some of the cliff dwellings, including Keats Seal, Batatakan, and Inscription House. But they needed somebody to look after it, so John Wetherill said he would gladly look after them without pay. In other words, a volunteer. This was before the Park Service even existed. It was the General Land Office. As such time as some regular superintendent could be appointed. It turns out he was in that role for about 28 years. 1909, a significant thing. Navajo man had told Louisa about a huge natural arch way back in the back country. And so an expedition was put together to try and find it. It turns out it was about 70 miles each way by horseback over some of the most rugged country imaginable. And they came around a corner and they saw the magnificent Rainbow Bridge. So you can imagine the thrill of being involved with that. John was a guide on that trip. And right away the government recognized that that was worthy of national monument status. Even though it was so remote, at the time it would seem like nobody could ever, not too many people could get out there to see it. Then 1910, the next year, the Wetherill family moved south of the Utah-Arizona border. There's a border right there, and started what's now the town of Kayenta. At first they just had tents and a trading post set up in tents, but later they built a lodge and they entertained literally thousands of visitors there down through the years. I've brought a photocopy of one of their guest registers that's in the house there. So this was a place people could come and stay if they wanted to explore that country. If they wanted to go out in the back country, they would come here. My great-grandfather would take them on pack trips, or they could just come and learn about Navajo culture or whatever. In the early days it was a lot of scientists, and then down through the years tourists started coming there. This is a book I was involved with putting together that has a history of Old Jato and Kayenta in it, and there's a copy of it out there if you want to look at it. It's mainly photos with captions, and probably 80% of the photos are from my great-grandparents' collection. That's one of the treasures we have, is literally thousands of old photographs. The first talk of a national park in that area, a huge national park that went beyond the monuments that were already there, was in 1929, and the 2 men that were involved in lobbying for this back in Washington were friends of the Wetherills. Byron Cummings was a professor. At that time he was at the University of Arizona, and he became known as an archaeologist. he said, very little of the land can ever be devoted to agriculture. The productive area is suitable for grazing only, and if these grazing rights could be preserved to the Indians and the section withdrawn from private entry, a permanent and healthful blessing could be confirmed upon all the lovers of the wonderful outdoors of northern Arizona and southern Utah. So he had this vision that some pristine country should be preserved for the benefit of people in the future who could come out and see it. This is from a letter that he sent to the government back in Washington. The second person who started lobbying at about the same time was a man named Charles Bernheimer. He was a wealthy New Yorker who started coming out, and in the 20s, most summers he would come out and go on an expedition of a month or more doing exploratory work. The calmness that comes over one here is something akin to celestial peace. So the thought there at that time was that we need places like this where people can go that are undisturbed by modern development, and they're good for people. Bernheimer wrote this book, Rainbow Bridge, about his early expeditions into the Rainbow Bridge area. It's an excellent book. And he continued to lobby. This is a map showing some of the country that he explored in the early 20s around Navajo Mountain. Rainbow Bridge is up there. It's extremely rugged country, and he was interested in going places where the topography and geography was not well documented, and of course looking for archaeological things and other things of interest as well. So also in 1929 he had this map made and he presented it to the Park Service and said, you need to think about setting aside this huge area as a national park, all the way from Monument Valley over to Rainbow Bridge and even beyond that. It was about 1.25 million acres. A huge concept that was pretty radical, but he had been out there and he knew the value of that country, and also that it was undisturbed for the most part. These are just some pictures from the country he was talking about. Monument Valley, of course Segi Canyon, and this is Keat Seal. This is a little scene in Segi Canyon that shows some of the beauty of the riparian areas there that you wouldn't even imagine existed in that desert country. Navajo Mountain, this is a view looking south across the San Juan River, and the ruggedness of this country is just incredible. I've been out there many times hiking around, and it's fascinating country, very beautiful, and it's a place you can get out and feel like that's the way it's looked since time immemorial. And then of course Rainbow Bridge. So from the perspective of people that have been there, it was really amazing country that needed to be preserved. Government had a different point of view. This was the deputy director of the Park Service talking about the national park proposed by Mr. Bernheimer. I haven't for the life of me been able to see it. I'm against it. So that's what these lobbyists were up against. I have a file about that thick of correspondence on this subject. I just kind of picked out some of the key things. Well, at the same time that this lobbying effort was underway, there was also an effort to annex some country to the Navajo people. And this was north of the Arizona border, what had previously been known as a Paiute Strip south of the San Juan River. It was felt that they needed more grazing land. So that's a map showing the area that it had been a reservation for the use of various Indian tribes, and it was generally called the Paiute Strip. And then the government, I think because of the possibility of oil development, opened it back up to public entry, and the people who lived in that area were trying to get it reserved again as part of the Navajo Nation. As far as the Wetherells were concerned, and John, I think in particular, and that's him standing right there, and Louisa, his wife, and Sister Wetherell's next to John, that's my grandmother. They said that the money that they set aside for land should be withdrawn and expended on water and agricultural development of the land already owned to produce more abundant crops and prevent destruction of sheep and other livestock. So they felt like it was important to have the land preserved as a park, and that there were other solutions to the shortage of grazing land for the Navajo people. Wetherells were very good friends with the Navajo people and maintained cordial relationships, but this idea rubbed Chi Dodge the wrong way. He had been the tribal chairman in earlier days. He said, "Wetherells always claimed to be our friends. I would like to know why they have turned against us. There must be something we don't know about. They probably have some good reason for it." So it was a question of expanding the reservation for the sake of more grazing, or setting this aside as a national park. One of the treasures that also, besides the photos, is these guest registers that we have from the Kayenta Lodge. We have 2 volumes. I brought a photocopy of the second volume because it's the one that covers the Rainbow Bridge Monument Valley era, and you might be interested in it. But as far as research, it's invaluable for me in pinning down people and dates and things that might not be documented any other place. So this is Christmas 1930. Mr. Stearns and Mr. Flatham came out from California, and they were going to take this metal boat up the Colorado River in the middle of winter, which wasn't a good idea, and it was an experimental boat. Anyway, John Wetherell talked him into letting him and Mr. Flatham go, and turns out the boat was no good, so they found an old abandoned wooden boat and ended up taking that. And the purpose became not to test the boat, but to take photos and movies to send to the government to convince them of the importance of that.
Do you know anything about the guy Stearns? You know, there was a very famous Californian named Abel Stearns from the Gold Rush period, and I think it was in Southern California too. I'm wondering if he's his kid.
It could be. This is Frederick Stearns from L.A., and he was,
Frederick A.
yeah, he was, I think, an executive in an insurance company. It could be, very well. Anyway, they had quite a trip falling into the river and so on. This is an old photo of John Wetherell, but he said it had a wonderful trip through a country of much grandeur and beauty. I doubt if it can be surpassed. He was 64 years old and not his health was starting to fail. And on one occasion, he stepped out of the boat onto an ice shelf and it broke and he fell in the water. But just to tell you his attitude in his journal, he said, "Got my first bath today. If I had a shave, I'd feel fine." Anyway, that's a whole story in itself. And they did end up falling in the river several times, and they lost their food at one point, and it's fascinating. But anyway, the purpose of after the boat failed was to get information to support this national park idea. And it's not clear whether they actually, any pictures or movies survived, but a couple of months later, some higher-ups in the Park Service did come out to look the country over. Mr. Tillotson, who was superintendent at Grand Canyon, and Mr. Toll, who was at Yellowstone. And on the left is the Kayenta guest register. Another resource you might want to be aware of on the right is the Rainbow Bridge Register. And this would have names of expedition participants who also who went to Rainbow Bridge. So this has these two men at Rainbow Bridge about the same time. So Mr. Toll sent in a report, and he said, this proposed national park would have great interest to the American public because of its unusual features of ethnology and archaeology, as well as because of its unique and remarkable scenic qualities. So for the first time, there's an actual National Park Service person other than John Wetherell who's saying this is really something we ought to look into. Well, as expected, people in Washington still were perplexed. This was one of the higher ups in the Park Service, and he said this is an unusual case. Both these superintendents agree it's of national park standard, but others who have not seen the area do not agree as to their recommendation. So typical government bureaucracy, I guess. Then due to some other lobbying, in 1932, the director of the Park Service, Horace Albright, came out to look the country over. And he had some superintendents from some of the other parks with him. And this is a photo of, this is Horace Albright here, next to John Wetherell, and superintendent of Southwest Monuments, Frank Pinkley, M.R. Tillotson from the Grand Canyon, Marshall Finnan from Mesa Verde. So it was quite a prestigious group. Horace Albright fell in love with the country. He saw what these people were saying. I've seen Rainbow Bridge, I've ridden to the top of Navajo Mountain, I've seen all the other glories of this great country just south of the San Juan. What a country it is. And he became one of the strongest proponents for this national park idea. In the meantime, the annexation of the Paiute Strip to the Navajo Reservation was moving forward. There was a meeting with the citizens of Blanding, Utah, who were originally against the annexation, and then finally said, we'll go along with it with certain stipulations. One of it is agreed that the scenic tracts are to be developed by the National Park Service with the cooperation of the Indian Service. So that was kind of a condition that if we annex this land to the Navajo Nation, we're going to agree to go forward with this park idea. However, the bill that was sent to Congress to annex this territory didn't include anything about the national park. And the Commissioner of Indian Affairs wrote the Director of the Park Service saying, we prefer not to disturb the bill in any way at this time, but await its enactment, and thereafter take up with you the matter of creating the proposed national park. So even though the agreement said they're going to do this, it wasn't a legal requirement. So now we enter Ansel Hall, and this is the Kayenta guest register. He came out in November of 1932, and that's the meeting that he discussed in this article. It's interesting, the man who was with him, Gunnar Woodforce, was a famous Grand Canyon painter, a very talented man who had a whole story on his own. And I don't know what their relationship was, but the two men came to Kayenta. John told Ansel Hall, you need to start this expedition. There again with the expectation that this would become a national park. The bill went to Congress and it was approved on March 1st, 1933. It had no language about the national park. What had been the Paiute Strip was now part of the Navajo Nation. But the expedition went on with the expectation that there would be a national park and that they were gathering information to support the value of that park to the American people. So these are pages from our guest book, 1933 personnel that were on the expedition. It's fascinating to look up these names on the internet and find out what their accomplishments were. I think that'd be a worthwhile project for somebody. And they set their sights on actually a larger area than the Paiute Strip. It included a lot of country down in Arizona that they were going to investigate. This is a page from the Kayenta Register, one of the, I think, probably a student at the time, Donald Graham Kelly, and there are a number of things like this. By the way, if you look up his name, you'll see he's the designer of the California state flag.
Wow.
So that's the kind of interesting thing you could learn by researching this. 1933 season came and went. The Park Service was dealing at that point with Ansel Hall, saying, "What's your opinion on the exact boundaries of this national park?" So Ansel Hall sent him a map. I don't have a copy of the map, but I do have the cover sheet to kind of adjust the boundaries. Then the 1934 expedition began, and that was involved a huge number of students and professors and scientists, and still I think with the same expectation of what they were going to accomplish. But in July of 1934, the Navajo Tribal Council met, and they talked about whether there would be a national park, and they decided they didn't want that. Whereas the Navajos have a greater love for their country and its beauties than any other people can possibly have, and wish to guard against any changes that may make any part of their country less beautiful. And at the bottom, they say, further resolved that the council petition the Secretary of the Interior and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to take immediate steps to have the National Park Service relinquish any rights that they may have acquired to any of our areas. So Canyon de Chelly, the Park Service was involved. They wanted them out. So pretty much this put the nail in the coffin of the national park idea, which was what the Rainbow Bridge Monument Valley was originally started to support. Horace Albright, the director of Park Service, had actually resigned before this, but reflecting on it, he said, "I wasn't used to defeat. I always won. I always got what I wanted. It has hung on me. It has hung on me all my life." It was devastating to him that this park wasn't created. The expedition went on, and we have some things in our family collection from it that were given to the Wetherells. Some really nice paintings with names on them, showing appreciation to the Wetherells for their participation. There's a portrait of Max Little Salt, and that's pretty neat, and some Indians and these were all done by J.G.K., an artist that I don't know too much about, but it might be worth finding out more about him. This is a painting done by a participant on the expedition, Martin Gamby, that we have. I've put out there on the table an article about Martin Gamby, by the way, if you want to know more about him. Besides John Wetherell, some other Wetherells were involved with the expedition. That picture on the left shows Ben Wetherell, John and Louisa's son, with Louisa and Ansel Hall. And Ben was a key figure in the expeditions. multiple years. Another family member was Milton Wetherill, John's nephew, who was involved with the expedition on a number of different years. But the other participants or people influenced the expedition people are the Native Americans. We have these great old pictures, and I think even the local residents who weren't official members of the expedition must have had a big part in meeting the participants and dealing with them, and they probably all learned from each other. So that's a part of the story that really needs to be told. And I want to focus a little bit on the different perspective that the Navajos in particular might have had from these college students and professors that came out, and what it was that maybe some of the participants learned from the Navajos, and what we can learn today that might help inform how this project proceeds. I was fortunate to find in my great-grandmother's collection this manuscript. It's an oral history of a Navajo man who was born in the 1850s. An amazing person, one of the nicest people you would ever hope to meet, upright and wise. And he told my great-grandmother, when I was a little boy, about 6 years old, my grandfather and my mother started me on the path of light. And he told her how he was trained as a boy and the important lessons that his grandfather and mother taught him that he was concerned might be lost in the future if she didn't write it down. He talks about early one spring, my brother and I were out herding sheep, and the wind was blowing, it was cold. We were angry because we had to leave the Hogan fire. We took the sheep out, and they were complaining to each other about being out in the cold wind. Well, they didn't realize it, but their grandfather had come up behind them and was listening to their conversation. He said, "Do not worry about the wind blowing. We cannot help it, and there is some reason for it." They thought about it and they realized that the wind was a good thing and they should appreciate it because it made them strong and it cleared the air of foul odors and brought the rain. The grandfather also taught him to observe what was around him out in nature, the little plants and birds and things that most people would think are so commonplace they're not worth noticing, and taught him how to learn from those things and develop a real wise approach to life. And I think the grandfather summed it up in this statement: all things are beautiful and full of interest if you observe them closely and study them. So the lesson I get out of this is the importance of maintaining a connection with nature. And I think that must have been something that the participants in the expedition learned from the Navajos. I think it was why these lobbyists for the national park were doing their thing, is because they thought that us humans, especially those of us who are living in artificial environments, really need a place we can go to that's natural and untouched by humans. And we can gain some of these same perceptions that Wolfkiller was taught to gain when he was a little boy. So he told the story to my great-grandmother, and she translated it and wrote it down. This was in the early 30s, about the time of the Rainbow Bridge Monument Valley expedition. And the publishers decided they didn't want to deal with it. They didn't think anybody would be interested. They thought that she was making this up and it was fictional. But fortunately, I found the manuscript, and a publisher actually contacted me and wanted to publish it. So we're able to get the word out now.
So you did publish it?
It's Gibbs Smith Publishers put it out a number of years ago, and it's available now. As far as my great-grandfather, I think he bought into this same outlook on life that Wolfkiller had. And he talks about this process of becoming, adapting yourself to nature. The desert will take care of you. At first it's all big and beautiful, but you're afraid of it. Then you begin to see its dangers and you hate it. Then you learn how to overcome its dangers, and the desert is home. So I don't think his outlook when he went through this process differed at all from his Navajo friends. Down through the years, he had the opportunity to take many people out in the back country on pack trips, and he could observe at least some of them actually being transformed by their experiences. So if they wanted to go to Rainbow Bridge, they had to go on this 70-mile pack trip, but the journey itself was part of the experience. And so I want to close with a woman that went out to Rainbow Bridge in 1919. We had a sense of courage towards life new to us all. The mere fact of our remoteness helped us shake off layers and layers of other people's personality, which we had falsely regarded as our own, and showed us new selves undreamed of. The point is, back in those days and today, it's important for us humans to have contact with nature that's untrammeled and corrupted by development, and to have a place we can go. I think probably in the big scheme of things, the land out there is better off without the Park Service. So it might have been fortunate that the park idea didn't go through. And I think the Navajos have done a great job in preserving a lot of that country. And it is a place where people can go. So my message to this project is part of the message that I think would honor not only the early people involved with the expedition, but the Native American people that live there, would be to put some emphasis on the importance of really getting out and seeing the natural world. And I think that's all I had.